Presidents, fellows and guests, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you from this platform today about my ongoing research at Lyminge, Kent. Not least, it provides me with the opportunity to record my personal gratitude to the Society for its generosity in providing funding for the 2010 excavations and for a subsequent phase of post-excavation analysis, the results of which I'm going to be drawing upon throughout my talk today. But the debt of gratitude goes back much further than that, for the Society was also a generous supporter of my previous work at Bishopston, an exercise in village core archaeology, targeting Anglo-Saxon antecedents, which in many senses provided the training ground for the more ambitious programme that I'm currently implementing at Lyminge. Today's platform also happens to be particularly timely, for it falls at the cusp of an energetic and exciting new phase in the evolution of the Lyminge project, spurred by a major grant by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in June, which is going to fund another 3 years research and excavation within the village. This fresh investment has already begun to pay dividends, as was referred to with some of the media coverage in the national press about new discoveries that were made on a site that we're going to be investigating in Lyminge for the next 3 years. That's going to be the centrepiece site. And apparently, according to Maeve Kennedy, I'm responsible for introducing a new word to the English lexicon, which is Beowulfy. That's how the finds that we made were described. So in terms of the way I'm going to structure this talk, I first want to look at the background context that's framing the research aims and questions of the Lyminge project, before providing a synopsis of the results, which I'm going to present as a chronological narrative spanning transformations in the archaeology between the later 5th and the 9th centuries AD. But one of the key points that I want to make, or will be making throughout my talk, is the potential that Lyminge holds as an Anglo-Saxon monastic landscape for addressing key questions concerning the social dynamics of monastic foundation in Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeologists of both early and later medieval monasticism have long called for the need to examine monastic sites on a holistic archaeological basis, whereby core buildings can be related to the wider precincts and the landscape beyond. And this need in an Anglo-Saxon context has been vividly demonstrated by recent work at the monastic headlands of Hartlepool, which we can see on this slide, and also at Whitby, which have provided glimpses of burial folky, domestic activity, settlement evidence, craft and economic processes at a considerable distance from the spiritual folky, from the core churches of these sites. However, as these recent quotes make clear, opportunities for such holistic examinations have been few and far between. It remains the case that our understanding is very much dominated by the core buildings of monastic complexes and equally constrained by quite disparate, disconnected keyhole glimpses. Now, this seriously limits our ability to appreciate the scale, texture of monastic landscapes as complex, multifunctional topographic entities. Equally undeveloped is our understanding of how these landscapes changed over time, particularly in relation to antecedent activity. And this is something on which we would really like to know more, because that relationship holds vital clues as to how the material practices of monastic communities were shaped by the very varied cultural fabric of the Anglo-Saxons themselves. And most recent historical research on the subject emphasises the very diverse nature of the early Anglo-Saxon church as an institution because of that underlying cultural diversity. The Lyminge project represents an attempt to address these problems and limitations in a particular socio-economic context, i.e. Kent, which was central to the early stages of the Anglo-Saxon conversion and provided one of the founts for Anglo-Saxon monasticism. If we look back at previous work in Kent, we can see that it epitomises many of the problems that I've noted on a national scale. Keyhole glimpses, often on poorly preserved archaeology, particularly in relation to some of the urban sites, the major urban sites that we know about. We know much, much less about the network of rural minsters that were founded in Kent in the first flourish of monastic foundation. And that's largely because the commercial work, the commercial archaeology that provides glimpses in urban context, just doesn't happen in rural locales. So we're presented with something of a paradox. Kent is central to both public and academic perceptions of the beginnings of English Christianity and has some very significant ecclesiastical heritage key sites like St. Augustine's Abbey backing that up. But actually we know remarkably little about how monastic life was actually organised within these institutions. Now this situation is particularly lamentable because Kent represents one of the best documented ecclesiastical provinces of pre-Viking England. We actually have some very good contemporary historical sources that allow us to characterise key features of the early Kentish church. And just to draw out some of those key features, the preponderance of double communities, double monasteries, borrowing very much from the Frankish pattern, the importance of royal cults which developed around the founding abbesses of these institutions, and I list some here. Another crucial factor is the fact that many of these double communities were attached to what, but certainly by the 8th century, was a stable network of royal estate centres. So we can characterise the early church in Kent in a way that's simply not possible for other parts of Anglo-Saxon England. And that provides rich opportunities for contextualising the archaeology of known sites in Kent. And I'm going to be talking about that later. So from that basis, then, one can draw out some strands distinctive to the to Anglo-Saxon monasticism in Kent that can be used to frame an archaeological research agenda, and I just want to highlight those themes to you now. First of all, the long-term stability that I talked about in relation to Kent's early royal centres means that we can examine monastic foundation as a dynamic process. We can explore the influence of antecedent patterns and how they changed or were transformed in relation to monastic foundation. It provides us with an opportunity to explore the double house as an early expression of Anglo-Saxon monasticism. To what extent can these establishments actually be identified on the ground archaeologically? We can also begin to address the Kentish Church as a monastic network. We know that they were founded, many of these institutions were founded at a similar time, in a similar socio-political context. But we'd like to know to what extent that network was integrated. Do these places and institutions share a common regional identity and material practices in monastic life? So let's now go on and look at Lyminge in a bit more detail as a case study. Now, it probably represents one of the best opportunities that we have to examine a rural minster in Kent on a holistic basis. And this is very much down to changes in fairly recent topography. If you look at the core of the village today, you can see that it's got many open spaces. And this is a historical accident connected to the fact that the construction of a railway in Lyminge in the 1880s, which is, you can see, it's now abandoned, but you can see the alignment of it here. That had the effect of pulling the subsequent development to the east of the village, thus leaving some large open spaces just on top of what was the original historic core. And these are the spaces that we've been targeting with large-scale excavation since 2008. Like the majority of the known monastic sites, Anglo-Saxon monastic sites in Kent, Lyminge has a long history of research, and that's something that we have to incorporate into our current research. Now, in terms of historical perspectives, the Anglo-Saxon double community of Lyminge is traditionally associated with an A-rated historical figure, no less than Queen Ethelberga, daughter of King Ethelbert of Kent, and widow of King Edwin of Northumbria, as described in Bede's ecclesiastical history. Unfortunately, the basis for making that connection is very insecure. It actually derives from late hagiography produced in Canterbury in the 11th century during a period of bitter rivalry between St. Augustine's and Christ Church, who were then actively appropriating the relics and the endowments belonging to the early Kentish minsters. Villagers visibly shudder when I tell them that the basis for that association is very insecure. It's indeed the case that we don't actually know that the relics that were translated from Lyminge to St. Gregory's Priory in Canterbury in the 11th century were actually those of a named Ethelberga, let alone the Ethelberga of Bede's narrative. Equally problematic is the suspiciously early foundation date of AD 633. Susan Kelly has recently examined the charters for Anglo-Saxon Lyminge and has argued that what we may have here is a sequence of development within the monastic core. It may be the case that it started life as a mortuary chapel, as we find on aristocratic estate centres in the Frankish kingdom, and it was only later refounded as a double monastery in the later 7th century. And I think recent discoveries, which I'm going to be outlining you today, support that supposition. Now, the cult, or the latter-day cult of Ethelberga, very much stands on the shoulders of Canon Jenkins, who we can see in this slide here, rector of Lyminge in the 1850s and 60s. A sort of a classic example of a Victorian cleric scholar. He was familiar with the historical associations of early Lyminge and dedicated himself to the SAL for reviving the former glory of Lyminge and its illustrious foundress. And it's to him that we owe the existence of memorabilia, such as this, placed in the south wall of the parish church. Canon Jenkins undertook a series of excavations in the churchyard and immediately beyond, and was successful in recovering a sequence of foundations relating to the monastic core, the early monastic core. Unfortunately, there are several ambiguities relating to the evidence that he found, which means that we can't be certain as to what is represented. There's a general consensus that the foundations immediately to the south of the parish church, and indeed partly superimposed by, relate to one of the group of early Kentish churches, the apsidal-ended structure there, an architectural expression of the Augustinian mission, and paralleled by similar churches at St. Augustine's and Reculver. I think where the real debate lies is in precisely what's represented by those foundations to the southwest of the medieval tower. Some have argued that these might represent a Roman bathhouse. Others have suggested that, in fact, we're looking at a suite of masonry buildings within the monastic core, or perhaps subsequent phases of church building on the same site. But the fact remains that the evidence doesn't survive in a good, or certainly the records based on that evidence aren't sufficiently secure for us to be able to decide between these various options. Now, within the HRC-funded phase of the project, we aim to do three things, or to deploy a three-pronged attack to improve understanding of those core buildings. First of all, we're going to provide funding and impetus to bring to publication a reinvestigation of those Southwest foundations by Tim Tatton Brown and Paul Bennett in the 1990s. We're also going to be undertaking ground-penetrating radar within and without the footprint of the medieval parish church. And finally, we're going to be conducting research on the Jenkins archive that's held here within the Society. So hopefully we'll be able to improve understanding of precisely what was happening in terms of the development of the monastic core. I now want to commence my synopsis of archaeological discoveries that have been found in the wider landscape. And I want to begin by looking firstly at the monastic antecedents that have been established through our work. First, it's necessary to say that there are many existing strands of evidence that allow us to chart Lyminge's emergence as a central place in the early Anglo-Saxon landscape. Not least is the name itself. It's a territory name, and the fact that it had been acquired by Lyminge suggests that it was serving a district centre role relatively early on. Lyminge is located in a very strategic point in the landscape, close to a Roman road connecting Canterbury with Portus Limanis. It's a natural funnel between the south coast and the populated hinterlands around Canterbury. Another crucial dimension here is the cemetery evidence. Lyminge has two known cemeteries, one to the north of the village, if I just point it out. The better known is this one here, excavated in the 1950s, or a portion work. And we've also got evidence for burials found in the construction of the Elam Railway line, more closer to where we've been excavating within the core of the village itself. Now, these cemeteries include evidence for a resident elite within Lyminge, obviously high-status burials, both male and female. This is just an example of some of the grave goods from one of the high-status 6th century burials found from the cemetery to the north of the village. There is, however, some very interesting new work that's been done, an unpublished phase of small-scale excavation on that same cemetery by the Canterbury Archaeological Trust in 2000. And what those discoveries included was evidence for horse burial or horse sacrifice, which is nicely paralleled by horse and rider burials known from other high-status interments at places like Eastry and Saltwood. So the important thing to get across here is that we're not only looking at evidence for sort of a social elite, but also cult observance in Lyminge at this time as well. However, it's really been excavations within the core of the village that have really enhanced this picture by providing the first evidence so far recovered for the domestic settlement component of a Kentish royal ville. Now, these glimpses were obtained in the two most recent campaigns of excavation within the village. In 2010, this area down here, and most recently this summer in 2012. Both these sites targeted low-lying portions of the village that immediately overlook the headwater and springhead of the River Nailbourne, which follows this line here. The springhead is located just at the bottom of a chalk spur that capped by the parish church and the monastic nucleus of the Anglo-Saxon foundation. Now, in its earliest phases, this early settlement focus comprises a classic combination of sunken featured buildings and fairly modest post-built halls, and I'll just show you some slides of some of the sunken featured buildings that we've excavated so far. We're probably looking at quite a diffusely organised settlement. Conjecture, that's the conjectural limits shown to you in that slide. Now, what was immediately apparent in 2010 was the richness of the cultural deposits contained in the sunken featured buildings. Now, what's particularly unusual about them is that they contain a mixture of redeposited midden material, sort of material that had been lying on the surface, on the ground surface for quite a long time, but alongside that, also the redeposition of primary refuse derived from households and domestic interiors. And that's what accounts for the recovery of whole objects or near complete objects, such as this pottery vessel here. Now, the cultural artefacts recovered include clear high-status signatures, including a wide array of vessel glass, of the type we can see here, otherwise types of glass vessels found in elite graves of the 6th and early 7th centuries in Kent. And we've got some nice time depth represented within these assemblages. The ones at the top there are classic type fossils for later 6th going into early 7th centuries, and those down below quite clearly belong to an earlier phase of occupation. Amongst the one of the most remarkable finds made in 2010, that first glimpse that we had of this early settlement focus, was this rather handsome plough Kultur, the first known example from early Anglo-Saxon England, which has been securely dated to the first half of the 7th century on the basis of radiocarbon dating. And I think there's a strong argument that the deposition of this object at the bottom of a sunken featured building was ritually motivated. Now, quite what this object represents in terms of plough technology is a very difficult question to answer. And there's already been quite a lot of debate about this. Does this represent the introduction of the heavy plough to this particular part of Anglo-Saxon England, or does it denote something quite different? Can't really enter those debates today, but I think what it does demonstrate is that, again, we're looking at a preeminent household residing at Lyminge, one that was able to draw upon quite innovative estate infrastructure, perhaps drawing upon continental links. The best parallels for this type of plough Kultur are from Merovingian France. So up until 2012, it was really the material cultural signatures that indicated that we had an elite presence within what now is the core of the village. Confirmation of that was dramatically uncovered in the most recent season of excavation on Tane Field, which is kind of a low spur surrounded, encircled by the River Nailbourne. Given that this didn't show up on geophysics, it was remarkably fortunate to have picked up the entirety of the ground plan of this magnificent hall in the excavation trench. What that tells us is that we're looking at a major building, 21 metres long, 8.5 metres wide, with an internal partition at the eastern end and central opposed doorways. There's also a lot of very useful constructional detail. We know that this was built using pairs of upright timbers set into continuous foundation trenches that were carefully cut into planks. We can see the shape of those timbers very clearly. And similar planks used for the doorposts. Some wonderful plank ghost preserved in that dissected doorpost just there. Now, there are clear affinities for this style of high-status building at other known excavated Anglo-Saxon royal complexes of the 7th century, including Yevering, Cowdrey's Down, and Sutton Courtenay. Another affinity that Lyminge shares is the fact that this building, almost certainly one of a suite, was imposed on a pre-existing Anglo-Saxon settlement with origins extending back into the migration period. However, there's one clear difference, and that's the fact that the theme of sort of rich cultural deposits that we see in earlier and contemporary sunken featured buildings extends to the hall and related contexts. So we can actually view the social practices associated with the use of these kind of architectural spaces. And I include here, show here a wide array of vessel glass and also objects associated with aristocratic display. This is a lovely 6th century horse harness mount of the type usually found in Anglo-Saxon graves. To actually find it here in the context of use amongst the warrior aristocracy who would have frequented places like Lyminge is absolutely wonderful. One of the striking features about the sequence of archaeology buried beneath Lyminge is that it includes evidence for quite a dramatic spatial redefinition of the settlement over the course of the second half of the 7th century. This involved the abandonment of that earlier settlement focus that I've been talking about, that one occupying the lower lying regions of the village, and a shift to the upper slopes of a chalk crest, or a chalk finger, the end of which is occupied by the monastic nucleus. And excavations in 2008 and 2009, and trial trenching in 2010, has provided a fairly sort of good body of evidence for interpreting the scale and internal characteristics of that settlement. And I want to go on and look at that in a bit more detail next. I should say that there are very clear differences between the character of this phase of settlement and the earlier settlement focus that I've been talking about. One such is the use of boundaries to define and articulate space, which suggests a level of formal planning in this phase of the settlement. We have a hierarchy of boundaries represented from major ditches through to smaller palisade trenches, and perhaps more ephemeral boundaries that we don't see in the archaeology, but are reflected in sterile areas of archaeology. These are crucial to building up a sequence, a chronological sequence for how this settlement evolved. And it appears to have been initiated by a primary boundary running along here, which is just to the south side of the southern boundary of the present-day churchyard. This has been dated through radiocarbon samples to the very end of the 7th century, perhaps early 8th. This was subsequently approached by a perpendicular arrangement of palisades, which are associated with the main phase of occupation, represented by dense structural arrays of post holes and clusters of pits. I think it's important to point out that had this boundary, this primary boundary, been encountered in a keyhole exercise, it probably would have been attributed to a valum monasteri, an enclosing or outer or peripheral boundary, when the case is it's very much internal. And it may well be the case that it was used to define an inner sanctified core, perhaps reserved for burial. I think it's important to point out that none of the southern extensions of the churchyard made in the 19th or 20th centuries have produced any evidence for domestic occupation. It appears remarkably clean. So that's perhaps what the significance of this internal boundary is. Now, amongst this swathe of occupation that we can see here and beyond, I think it's possible to make a distinction, a zonation, or two different zones, which I'm going to outline to you briefly. First of all, we have evidence for an inner domestic sector. And we have a number of structures represented in this area, surrounded by dense concentrations of latrine and rubbish pits. Now, the structural evidence is difficult to interpret because of later intercutting of medieval ditches, but nevertheless, I think there's sufficient there to suggest what we're looking at is small-scale buildings, perhaps in the region of 6 metres long to 4 metres wide, forming a cluster. I don't think these are ancillary buildings because of the proximity of lots of domestic signatures in the neighbouring pits, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I think actually they provide a good parallel, a Kentish analogy, for the monastic cells excavated at Hartlepool and also on Frankish sites like Hamage in Nord. But really it's the rock-cut pits found adjacent clusters that provide the key evidence for those domestic signatures. Household furnishings such as keys. These pits contain the densest concentrations of household waste and also human cess. And they form just a proportion of about 120 rock-cut pits that were found across the full extent of the settlement. And again, this is a very radical difference to the nature of the occupation in the early Anglo-Saxon settlement focus, which included much fewer pits and far more ephemeral in scale, a very different approach to the management of waste. Outside this domestic core, there's evidence for peripheral economic activities of two types, or certainly two types have been shown in the archaeology that we've undertaken so far, both of which provide key insights into the workings of the monastic economy. First of all, is this wonderful building measuring 19 metres wide, about 6.5 long, and 6.5 metres wide. You can see it's marked out there on the ground for us. It's an unusual building for this period, the 8th and 9th centuries, in that it has a central alignment of posts running like a central, straight down the long alignment of the building. It's also associated with an external metal yard formed of crushed flint. You can see it being dissected there in the top slide on the top left. It's the case that the pits found in association with this structure contain dense concentrations of charred grain. And I think if you put these various pieces of evidence together, what we're looking at, I think there's a strong case for this, for a Middle Saxon granary with an associated threshing floor. So evidence, in other words, for the storage and conversion of agricultural surplus. Another activity located on the periphery is an ironworking installation. This was found in trial trenching in 2010. In this area here, where we've got these dense geophysical anomalies which we are keen to test. What that showed is that all this noise that we can see actually relates to extensive spreads of smithing and smelting slag. Associated pits produced stratified dating evidence and also fragmented iron objects intended for recycling. So we can confirm that this is Middle Saxon ironworking represented on this site, about 150 metres northwest of the monastic nucleus, and providing a nice analogy for similar metalworking installations found on the periphery of early medieval monastic communities in Ireland. And I should just say that this part of Lyminge's economy is otherwise attested in charter references, including this one, which is the earliest reference to iron extracting rights from Anglo-Saxon England. Now I want to move next away from aspects of the built environment and spatial planning to look at more closely at insights gained from preliminary analysis of the cultural and bioarchaeological assemblages recovered from the monastic phase of occupation. Now, the potential of pits and ditches as artefacts, as traps for this material, was maximised through the blanket policy of dry sieving and also through extensive sampling, bulk sampling for on-site flotation. As a result, Lyminge has generated some of the richest artefactual, zooarchaeological and paleoecological assemblages from an Anglo-Saxon site south of the River Thames. And here I'd like to acknowledge the input of Holly Baker and Jill Campbell at English Heritage for helping to assess that material. And also I'd like to mention a PhD candidate, Zoe Knapp, who's with us today, who will be analysing, taking forward analysis of the zooarchae assemblages in her research. Now, by putting together these Middle Saxon assemblages with a very rich material from the early Anglo-Saxon settlement focus that I've talked about, we're provided with a very powerful tool for tracking diachronic changes in daily life between the 6th and the 9th centuries. I don't have time to examine all dimensions of that today, so I'm just going to select myself to a few that I think highlight where the potential lies. And I think in this discussion, I mean, one of the things I'll be emphasising is the importance of changing patterns of interaction with the wider world as crucial to shaping the cultural identity and material practices of Lyminge through this period of social transformation. And here again, there is lots of scope for integrating historical perspectives informed by the rich charter record for the growth of Lyminge's endowment and economic resources between the 7th and 9th centuries AD. So just the first of these themes then is that of marine signatures. Lyminge has produced an extensive fishbone assemblage, indeed one of the largest so far recovered from Anglo-Saxon England, particularly from the 8th and 9th century phases. What these assemblages strikingly bring to light is the rise to dominance of marine species, large fish species like cod and ling, which accounted for as much as 35% of the hand and sieve collected assemblages, which is incredibly high. The bulk sieve component tells us that these marine species supplemented smaller fish, things like eel, particularly eel, that demonstrate continuity back into the 6th and 7th century contexts. These earlier contexts didn't produce any of the larger fish bones, only the smaller ones captured through flotation. And it's interesting to note that the neighbouring village to Lyminge, Elam, provides a direct toponymic reference to the harvesting of these resources in nearby rivers and streams. So it's really the upsurge in marine species that are significant, and that's also reflected in the much greater quantities of marine molluscs that were recovered from the 8th and 9th centuries, 8th, 9th and century context. And again, there's nice charter evidence for the exploitation of these resources as well. So we have unequivocal evidence then for a transition to a heavily marine-influenced dietary regime, which I think makes most sense in terms of monastic food regulations of the type laid down in the rule of St. Benedict. I think we're seeing it particularly clearly at Lyminge. A similar interpretation could be placed on other zooarchaeological trends, including the rise to dominance of domestic fowl in the 8th and 9th century contexts, and a narrowing in the exploitation of wild species alongside that, as shown in these charts. And again, work by zooarchaeologists such as Keith Dobney demonstrate that this kind of signature is one very much associated with Anglo-Saxon monastic sites. Equally striking is a clear transition in the relative importance of the main domesticates in relation to those two phases of archaeology in Lyminge. Whereas pig dominates in the 6th and 7th century contexts, and this is very much regarded as a high status signature in that early period, sheep become the dominant species in the 8th and 9th. As Naomi Sykes has shown, this pattern accords with wider evidence for monastic involvement in the expansion of the Anglo-Saxon wool industry. And in Lyminge's case, this may have been catalysed by the acquisition of salt marsh grazing in Romney Marsh. It comes out clearly in the charter evidence. Those wider connections, or these wider connections with the coast and beyond, are also materialised in various aspects of the artefactual record, including things like imported pottery and imported glass as well. What we're probably seeing here are byproducts of an unseen trade in wine, essential to the liturgical needs of monastic communities such as Lyminge. We have a series of charters granting toll remissions to minsters located in north part of Kent that were directly plugged into the Thames estuary, and international trading links focused on the Thames estuary, probably for the same reasons, to acquire similar exotics. In Lyminge's case, it probably relied upon dependent communities located in the coastal part of its endowment, places like Santon, which would have provisioned it with those essential needs, those vital commodities. Sorry. The final dimension that I want to examine in relation to wider interactions takes me back to one of those themes that I introduced at the beginning, the ability to see a monastic network through shared cultural traditions in Kent, in eastern Kent. Now, this is admittedly a very challenging thing to do because other sites are so poorly known, recorded archaeologically. On the other hand, I think there are hints that are worth exploring through further research. One such is the assemblages of portable material culture recovered from Lyminge and from sites like Minster and Sheppey, which has received a programme of many small-scale investigations. And I think one of the distinctive things about these assemblages is the predominance of these delicate dress pins and tweezers. One does not see the wider range of personal ornaments that one finds in monastic communities further north along the eastern seaboard in Anglo-Saxon England, places like Whitby. Now, it's remarkably difficult to gender personal ornaments in this period because of the lack of grave goods. But I'm just wondering whether what we're seeing here are the type of objects that we use to secure veils, in which case this restricted range could be used as a proxy for identifying female religious, or the importance of female religious as part of these composite monastic communities in Anglo-Saxon Kent. The second hint of shared identity is this very characteristic pottery that we can see at the bottom, characterised by boss-decorated surfaces. This is, as far as we're aware, is restricted to monastic sites in East Kent. And if we include, I'm including here Santon, which I think the Charter Evidence suggests, it was a direct dependency of the inland monastic community at Lyminge. So we have a distinctive type of pottery being produced, and perhaps what that alludes to is industry being brought under the direct control of monastic communities, as we've previously seen in relation to ironworking and wool production. So just working towards a conclusion, just to summarise what we have reflected in our archaeological sequence at Lyminge. Two distinct settlement foci, the earlier, late 5th to early 7th centuries, culminating in the imposition of our Great Hall, which most certainly would have formed part of a complex. There are indications for that. What one might think of as a localised Middle Saxon shift with spatial redefinition of settlement around the monastic nucleus, accompanied by a suite of transformations. Tighter spatial organisation, the use of boundaries to define space and to zone different activities. The appearance of service structures of one type or another, latrines, storage, rubbish pits, and our putative threshing barn. and new types of monastic consumption stroke production, exploiting new interrelationships with the wider world. And this plan here that's recently been drawn up just shows you those two spatially distinct settlement foci that show up particularly clearly in the archaeological record. In this talk, I've attempted to demonstrate how a holistic examination of Lyminge as an early medieval monastic landscape can generate new archaeological insights into the social dynamics of monastic foundation in Anglo-Saxon England. Skeptics in the audience may argue that the social transformations I've outlined merely reflect more general socio-economic change in the Anglo-Saxon countryside that has relatively little to do with the process of Christian conversion and the role that monasteries played in that process. I would argue that's to miss the point. Lyminge is a distinctive and special type of archaeological site. As a centre of royal power, its fortunes are inextricably bound with the rise of the historical kingdom of Kent and the socio-political transformations which allowed that to happen, of which Christianization was arguably the most significant and enduring. As a case study, Lyminge thus allows us to examine the role of monastic foundation as an active strategy for proclaiming and embedding that new worldview across the Anglo-Saxon landscape. The next 3 years will enhance the picture which I've outlined today through a targeted programme of research activities, many of which I've mentioned. This programme could not have been conceived nor implemented without the systematic evaluation of previous results enabled through the generosity of this society. Looking ahead, I take great personal store in being able to work alongside an established team of archaeologists whose dedication, friendship and collegiality underpins all that's been achieved in Lyminge so far. And I'm also relishing the opportunity of fostering new working relationships through partnerships with Canterbury Archaeological Trust and Kent Archaeological Society. Personal thanks must go to the core project team based at Reading, and here I'd like to mention Dr. Alexandra Knox, the postdoctoral research assistant on the project, and also Simon Maslin, who combines the roles of geoarchaeologist and data manager. Thanks also to members of the field staff who coalesce on Lyminge each summer for the fieldwork seasons. Rosie Cummings, Helen Harrington, Rue Mitchison, David Mudd, Neil Mullins and Celia Winning. Recently joined by Andrew McIntosh and Keith Parfitt from the Canterbury Archaeological Trust. But last not least, I wish to acknowledge the many Lyminge residents whose enthusiasm and active participation has helped to embed our research firmly within the local community. Thank you.